Welcome back. It's time to have a look at the data in the interviews and see whether it stands up to scrutiny. I'll put those questions up for you as a reference as we go through. So, who's right? Is it fake news or not? Well, let's start by taking a look at Chris Wallace's interview. So the chart that Chris Wallace used can be found at the Johns Hopkins Coronavirus Resource Centre, which is a very useful site that we'll see again later in the unit. And if we look at the variation across countries, this is the one that he used. So a few things about this one. Firstly, it's very clear here that the chart only refers to what they call the 20 countries currently most affected by COVID-19 worldwide. So the first thing to note is that this is in no way a comparison of all of the countries in the world. The second thing to note is that this chart has two versions. So one is the observed case fatality ratio, which is the ratio relative to the number of cases that have been observed, and the second is the per capita ratio, or in this case per 100,000 population. So this relates to our question about what does it mean to say that a country has the highest or lowest mortality rate in the world. Well, there's more than one possible definition that you can use for that. In the questions, we asked what are the key independent variables that have a role in determining the outcome. So there are at least 5 that I think we ought to think about. So one is the actual number of cases, or a measure of the actual spread. The second one is the rate of testing, which will determine how many cases we pick up. The third is about the demographics, and in particular the age demographics, although there are other demographics that also have a bearing. The fourth is the effectiveness of treatment. So they're the actual health outcomes. And the fifth one is the country population. So if we consider each of those two definitions for the rate, the first one was the case fatality rate, and the second one was the per capita. So we might then want to have a think about what effect the independent variables have on those different metrics. So if we think about the number of cases, for example, well, it's going to have an effect on the per capita rate, because the more cases you have, the more fatalities you're going to have. So that's going to have an effect which increases the per capita rate. When it comes to the actual case rate, the number of cases shouldn't affect that, because and we'll assume here that the cases that the demographics are fairly homogeneous and the cases spread fairly homogenously. So the number of the case rate is relative to the number of cases. The case fatality rate won't increase with the number of cases. It will be roughly constant. The rate of testing will affect the case fatality rate, because the rate is going to depend upon the number of cases that you find. So the rate of testing will have an effect on that, and the more you test, the more you'll tend to lower the case fatality rate. The rate of testing shouldn't affect the per capita rate, because that's about how many cases you have within the country, not how many you find through testing. The demographics will affect both outcomes. The effectiveness of treating will also affect both outcomes. The population is an interesting one. So the population won't affect the per capita rate, because the per capita rate moves in proportion, or is constant relative to the population. So higher rate is proportional to a higher population. So that one won't be affected. Whether the population affects the case fatality rate is an interesting question, which I'll leave you to have a think about. The next thing is what things the government and the society more generally have control over, or what things are dependent on government policy. So in this case, the spread is going to be affected by policy. So there are certain things that the community and the government can do to affect the spread. The rate of testing will be affected by the government policy. The demographics we can assume is relatively fixed at a given point in time, so that's not something that can be in the short term affected by policy. The effectiveness of treatment will be affected by the health response, and of course the population, again in the short term, is not directly affected by policy. So there are some of the key independent variables that drive the outcomes, and you may be able to think of some additional ones to that. So returning to our analysis of the Chris Wallace interview, so we've seen some of the different determinants of the fatality rates. We've seen the two definitions provided by Johns Hopkins, and if we look at the Johns Hopkins chart, then we can see that the USA was the 7th highest on the chart at the time of interview. So the key thing there, of course, was that that was a select group of countries, and so Chris Wallace's clear statement that the US has the 7th highest fatality rate in the world is false. I have got a note there to ask the question, what is it that we mean by the 20 most affected countries. So again, there's lots of definitions that could have. It could be to do with the most cases in the country. It could be the most cases per capita. It could be the most fatalities. Could be the highest total. And at the time when I originally wrote this, Belgium actually had the second highest case fatality rate after Yemen, and the second highest mortality rate after the second highest per capita rate after San Marino. And if we have a look here, we can see there's actually a list of all the countries. So if we look at the CFR, we can see that Belgium's still third there, and if we look at the per capita, then Belgium's still running second there. And yet, if we look at this main chart that's provided, then Belgium doesn't appear at all. So it's not clear not immediately clear what they mean by that. So we've determined that according to the observed CFR, the US was the 7th highest rate, but we've said that it's false that it's the 7th highest rate in the world. So perhaps we'd like to know where it does lie within the world. And if we go back to the case fatality rate, so we could go through and we could count all of those, but what we're going to do is get a little help from Python. So what I'm going to do here is just add a Python cell. Okay, I'm going to go back to Johns Hopkins, and I'm just going to manually scrape some data off the web there. Just copy that. Okay, come back to our notebook, and I'm going to create a new file. So I'll call that countries. I'll make that a text file. And then I'll paste our data in there. So that process doesn't always work quite as easily as this, but in this case it works quite well. And you actually get a similar kind of file to what we'll be using in some of the labs, which is in this case is called a TSV, tab separated value file. So these little arrowheads here actually represent tab characters within the file. First thing I'm going to do is have a look how many countries there are altogether. So I can do that by opening the file. I'll open that for reading, and I'll just call that file for now. So one way I can find out how many lines are in that file is to read the file, split it at the line breaks into a list, and then look at the length of that list. So I'll say print file .read split lines, and I'll print the length of that. Okay, so we've got 171 lines in the file. Actually, the first 7 of those, the first 6 of those are not actually countries. So we probably should print the length minus 6. See that there's 165 countries. Okay, so what if we want to see where the US lies within that list? We could do it by looking at each one of those lines, but let's do it a little bit differently. Let's again open countries for reading. And this time we'll just read in the lines one at a time until we get to a line that contains the US. So let's set up a counter, and then let's look at the lines. Line. If the US is in the line, then we're going to print the count, and just to check our work, see if we're right, we'll also print out the line, and of course we have to remember to increment the count each time through. Let's give that a try. Okay, so we can see there the US is 58th in line in that file, but remember that the first 6 lines were not actual data lines. So what we might do is we might just say for I in range 6, which will actually go from 0 to 5 as we know. File dot read line. Okay, and so we can see we've chewed up the first 6 lines there, and we've started counting from 1 at the next line. Okay, so a bit of Python to help us out. Let's move on to Trump now. So for the president, the chart can actually be found at the site Our World in Data, which is also another incredibly useful site, and that comes from this chart here, which is a dynamic chart. You can put in whatever countries you like and see what the output is like. This is a really useful site, and we'll use this again actually. It provides us not with just with things that you can look through yourself, but also provides us with a download link where we can download the data, which is very useful. If we go back to the chart, so if we look up at the top here, in this case they've been very clear what the definition is that they're using, so what the ratio is, and they've also said during an outbreak the CFR is a poor measure of the mortality risk of the disease, and that obviously relates back to things around testing and discovery and the like. So it's relatively, we could say, honest site, and they've got a link there that you can read to look at a lot more detail about that. So that's a very good example of a professional presentation of data. It's got a clear definition. It's got some riders about the use of that data, that it's a poor measure in a dynamic situation, and it's got somewhere you can go for more information about how the data came about, its assumptions and so forth. So that's a good example of what we would like to produce as data scientists. Okay. We can see that although the chart that that Trump used, according to Chris Wallace, was this version here. So the countries are chosen so that actually the United States, I think it was slightly ahead of Brazil here as well at the time of the interview. So it was the second or third best, and they say in the world. We know it's not in the world, it's a small selection of countries that they've chosen. If we look at a more representative set of countries, so here we've chosen some of the ones that have the best figures according to that metric, some of the ones that have the worst figures, and we can see that the US is somewhere in the middle, and actually it's not that far from what they label as world. So this is a fair comparison of where the US stands compared to a range of countries on this metric only, and that's really important. So we can't conclude just from looking at that, we can't make statements like US is doing best in the world or the worst in the world. All we can do is make a statement on how it compares on that particular metric and be clear about what that metric is. Okay, we don't know, by the way, what world means here. It could be an average of countries, it could be a weighted average of countries, it could be a number of things. So the President's statement varies between one of the lowest, maybe the lowest, number one low, and the best. Clearly that's a false statement. So a little bit of commentary about what we've looked at there. So Trump is clearly not on top of his facts, and you would hope that someone in his position would be more comprehensively briefed and have a better understanding, given that's such a crisis facing the country. You'd expect them to have a better understanding. But in some ways, my concern here is more with Wallace and his team. Wallace is thought of as a relatively reputable interviewer, and they have no excuse for this lack of precision and clarity in what they say in this interview, because unlike the interviewee, Trump in this case has to answer on the spot. So he has to have the numbers at his fingertips. The interviewer has had time to prepare. They know what questions they're going to ask, and they should be able to state the facts clearly and concisely. So Wallace has egg on his face in this case. And I think it's pretty clear that Fox know that they've been caught out, because the overlay that Fox put on seeks to obfuscate rather than clarify the conversation and the data. So the Wallace voiceover says, "All right, it's a little complicated, but bear with us." Well, it's not a little complicated, it's very straightforward. You just need to clearly state what the figure is that you're reporting. He goes on to say, we went with the numbers from Johns Hopkins University, which charted the mortality rate for 20 countries hit by the virus. The US ranked 7th, better than United Kingdom, worse than Brazil and Russia. The White House went with this chart from the European CDC, which shows Italy and Spain doing worse, countries like Brazil and South Korea doing better. Other countries doing better, like Russia, aren't included in the White House chart. Well, that's true, but other countries that are doing worse are also not included in the White House chart. But this kind of we went with, they went with shtick is pretty poor. It gives the impression that you get to pick and choose what kind of data you want for what kind of point you want to make in the interview. You know, we're kind of both right, but we had a difference of opinion because we chose different data, and that's not the case at all. The data is the same, or near enough the same. There may be some slight variations depending on things like time and collection in both cases. If you choose the same countries, you get the same order, and I've done that here to demonstrate. So here's the list from Johns Hopkins, and this is the same list in graphical form from the European CDC, and the order here is exactly the same as the order there. So the discrepancy is not about whose data you chose to go with, it's about the fact that you've both made incorrect statements from the data. So in both cases they've selectively chosen data to push their case. So to finish off just with this example, let's have another look at Ari Melba and what he says about the data.
I want to show you, before we show you what the president is claiming, here is the numerical fact. The United States has a very bad mortality rate when it comes to this issue. It's the third highest in the world. Now, this fact reflects poorly on the Trump administration's response, because other countries, as we've been discussing, facing the same pandemic, have handled it better, saved more lives. And then you have Donald Trump falsely claiming the opposite, and you're about to see Chris Wallace fact-check him in real time.
I think we have one of the lowest mortality rates in the world. We're going to take a look.
We had 900 deaths on a single day.
Again, the numbers tell the story. The U.S. is the third highest in deaths per capita. Donald Trump also broadly claiming that eventually all of his claims will be vindicated.
I'll be right eventually. I will be right eventually.
There's a little bit of humour at the end there. Be right eventually, just like a clock. A stopped clock is right twice a day. So Melba has used the Johns Hopkins analysis as well. But Melba has switched definition. So Melba's actually switched to this one here, which comes out worse for the US. So he's quietly switched from the per capita, from the case ratio data to the per capita data. There's no problem in using that data, reporting on that data, but he set himself up there as saying that he is fact-checking this interview, and he should clarify that he's reporting on a different metric if he's using something different to what they were discussing within that interview. The US is doing relatively poorly on that metric, around 10th worst from that country list at the time of writing. But Melba's statement that it's the third worst is false. Okay, so the verdict there, Wallace's clip is fake news, and Melba's clip, unfortunately, is also fake news. Okay, time for an intermission, and next I'd like to show you a video very important video. It's entitled "Why Do Our Brains Love Fake News?" But it's actually about well-known psychological research into what's known as confirmation bias and what we can do about it. So I'll stop the video and I'll paste a link to this video on the webpage.